Greetings. Thanks for being here in 3 dimensions. We're all here. It's so exciting to have this. We are recording, obviously, but not just be a Zoom gathering. So our primary intention is to hear from these esteemed panelists, but also to build community and really have Center for Environment Community Equity be a space of networking and friendships and collaboration and research and scholarly and teaching partnerships and community building. So I'm Grady Lovelace. I'm here at SAS around the corner, and I'm honored to be Associate Director of CC, the new center, with Simon Nicholson, who sends on his regrets. He's at an emergency meeting downstairs, and also Kiho Kim, whom I just saw yonder, is the other Associate Director. And Justine Williams is so many things. What is your official title, Justine?
Assistant Director and Operations Manager.
There it is. And Kira Jones, who is yonder, is so many things. Kira, what is your official title?
Program Coordinator.
Okay, she's coordinating all of us. So I think what we'll do is we'll dive in actually with a little bit of intro to CC. You all have come because you're already part of this community. But this is the inaugural Colloquium event of the inaugural Colloquium series. So this is a great event. We're really excited to have you all here. It'll be the last Thursday of every month from here on for the rest of the semester. And so we decided to focus on climate migration mobility because we have such great expertise on the matter and because of its global significance. Next month, please join us for Indigenous Sovereignties. This is going to be a very powerful colloquium organized by Veronica Limeberry, who is a doctoral candidate about ready to defend here at SIS. But also the inaugural postdoc of CC. So she is leading a broader research project on Indigenous ecologies, Indigenous sovereignties. And so that will have Professor Elizabeth Rule, Professor Ezra Rosser, Professor Bill Snape, and then the fourth person, whom we will know, but it's a great lineup, so mark your calendars. And then we're working with 4 preliminary themes for our first year, which is climate mobilities, which we'll get going in a moment, Indigenous sovereignties, as well as assessment of climate transformation and change from the ground up as a counterweight to COP27 UNFCCC assessment of climate that is so heads of state focused and so kind of corporate dominated. Kind of thinking what would be a global conversation about climate reform and transformation that is really grassroots. And then the 4th topic, close to my heart, is food and land and agriculture and agrarian crisis. So on April 30th and May 1st, we're having a summit called Pointing the Farm Bill Toward Racial Justice with members of Congress and civil society leaders and farmer elders and a lot of focusing on racial justice with the Farm Bill, culminating in a Senate briefing on Tuesday the 2nd, and that will be at Airlie. So we have like a big block of rooms. So we're going to be kind of reaching out if you're interested in learning about Airlie, which is AU's piece of land, which has all of this potential, as well as agricultural policy from the perspective of environmental and racial justice. Other ways that you could be involved with CC, Justine.
I think that about sums it up. We're working really hard on building a website that should be up soon. We have lots of information kind of waiting in the queue to get lined up. We have a newsletter that we would love for you to sign up for, and social media, share with all your students. And other than that, just really delighted to be here with you. We're working really hard this semester to build up and launch infrastructure to support collaborative research. So, as Garrett mentioned, these are some of the 4 themes we're prioritizing, but they're not exclusive. So please feel free to reach out to you if you would like or interested in having a cross-disciplinary workshop. If you would like fundraising and grant writing help, we're early, but those are the kind of resources we're trying to help build up. So look forward to working with you all.
Another theme we've been working with is in partnership with the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center on geographies of climate justice in the DMV and beyond. And so a lot of these events this spring are just building up to that, but we're really excited to work with students, undergrad, grad and doctoral students, postdocs, as well as faculty and staff across the whole campus, really from COGA to law school, SPA, on out. So here, yes, Jesse.
Would it be okay if we open the door and prop it open and open a window? It'll be a little bit of noise, but I think it would be a healthier environment.
Very
Sure.
Thanks. I appreciate that.
Yes, thank you. So Claire Brunel is friend and a colleague and a collaborator, and was involved in previous iterations of CC, and was already thinking about collaborative environmental scholarship and doing collaborative environmental study scholarship. She is an economist by training, and her research focuses on issues at the intersection of environmental economics and international economics at large. So this examines climate change and environmental regulation and their cross-border effects, the relocation of industries, the transfer of green technologies, human migration, and trade. Prior to SIS, she worked at the research department of the World Bank, the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and the Embassy of France as trade policy attaché. So give a round of applause just for her. Share her research. Jessie, also friend and collaborator, is a human geographer of environmental justice and rural being. By the way, SIS is proud to have both of these in our intellectual community. He studies the social and political economic causes of the precarity and suffering of natural resource dependent communities. He conducts research in 4 interlinked areas: decentralization and democratic local government, natural resource tenure and access, distribution along natural resource commodity chains, and household vulnerability in the face of climate change. And he draws on a number of approaches and disciplines and fields and experiences, and has trained over 80 young scholars in their own countries to conduct in-depth policy research and to translate that into relevant policy interventions. So he has been at the SIS for since 2018, and prior to that was at the Anthropology of Natural Resources and Environmental Sciences at the University of Illinois, where he really directed and led the entire campus-wide social dimensions of environmental policy program. So it's great to have you here to think about what CC could be, all its potential here at AU. He was also a senior associate in the Institutions and Governance program at the WRI, World Resources Institute, and part of the Yale Program in Agrarian Studies, Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology, Woodrow Wilson, all kinds of other wonderful places, and most recently was a Guggenheim Fellow from 2018 to 2019. So welcome, Jessie. And then we have Professor Rob Albro, who is joining us from the Center for Latin American Latino Studies, which CC very much wants to partner with, not just ARPC, but Center for Latin American Latino Studies. So we're delighted to be forging that those relationships. He has maintained a long-term ethnographic focus on urban and indigenous politics in Bolivia, and is an expert on Latin American social and indigenous movements across the Andes, as well as across Latin America. He researches and regularly writes about domestic and international cultural policy framework around cultural rights, cultural diplomacy, and intersections between cultural knowledge, security, and technology, and religion. This wasn't in the bio, but you will have had a lot of grants about how religion and spiritual dimensions infuse climate justice activism in the Andes and beyond, which I think is very cutting edge. So round of applause for Dr. Albro. And Claire. Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, so hi everyone. Thank you for coming. It's so nice to see the room so full. So given that we were given a short amount of time, I'm just going to talk about one paper. And so this is joint work with Maggie Liu at Smith College and at the U.S. Department of Treasury, where I'm going to look at the links between weather shocks and internal migration, and we're going to be looking at Brazil in particular. So the basic logic here is, when you have changes to the weather, whether it's temperature or precipitation, it affects economic activity. So if you're a farmer, this weather might lead you to have less yields from your crops or no yields at all from your crops. And so you're going to make a lot less money than you used to due to this changing weather. So you're either going to make less money than you used to or no money at all. But the point is that you have some income shock. And so how do you actually adapt to this? Well, you have a number of different channels, which it turns out are all linked to migration. So one of the first things that you could do is you can say, okay, well, here my crop doesn't grow anymore. So one of the options I have is I'm going to switch to a different crop that is going to be more climate resilient. And even though you're staying put, you can actually still have an effect on migration, because this new crop that you're planting could require more workers on your field or less workers on your field. And so you might have people coming in and out of your region or your state as a result of this change in the crop that you're planting. The other option that you have is you say, I don't want to learn to like, have a new crop. I don't want to find different suppliers for my seeds, find different vendors for my crops. I want to keep planting what I already know how to plant. But since I can't do it here anymore because the climate has changed, I'm going to need to move to a different part of the country to keep planting my crops. Obviously, since you're moving to a different part of the country, this is a very clear link to migration. And then the third option is you may decide that it's not worth it for you to stay in the agricultural sector. And so you might just give up and decide to go into either manufacturing or services. Usually that involves a change from an urban area to a rural area. So there's a migration link here as well. So whatever channel you decide to adapt through, there's going to be a link to migration. And so we're trying to figure out to what extent do households use migration as a way of adapting to this changing climate. And so before I go any further, I just want to state that this is not a hypothetical issue. This is not something that's only going to happen in the future. Climate migration is happening already right now. And so you have some headlines here of newspapers, some of the global south, some of the global north, but this climate migration is happening all over the world. And this is something that, given the predictions of climate models, we can expect bigger changes in temperatures than we have seen so far. And so we can expect the flows of migration to be much larger in the future than they are now. Keeping in mind that if you think about how European countries dealt with relatively small flows of Syrian migrants, it gives you an idea of how unprepared we are to deal with these kinds of flows. And, if you, the literature gives us some information, but there's still so much more that we need to understand. It's a relatively recent part of the literature. It's growing fast. But what we're doing here in the paper is we're saying, we have quite a bit of literature on how extreme weather events are going to lead people to leave and then potentially come back. But when it comes to gradual changes to the climate, it's a very different story. And so we want to look at those gradual, slow onset climate change, so gradual changes to temperature and precipitation, and see how that affects households. So we're using this case of Brazil. Brazil is a large agricultural producer. A lot of people, especially at the beginning of our time period, we have about a quarter of the population is employed in the agricultural sector. Okay. By the end of our time period, 30 years later, you still have 16% of people employed in the agricultural sector. So it's a big sector. And we have census data, which covers about 10 million individuals in Brazil. And we're going to have information about everybody, where they moved from, where they moved to, and in what time. And what that allows us to do is we have information about the place that you left. So there's plenty of reasons why people decide to migrate, right? Maybe you don't like the political situation in your origin, and so you want to move away from it. Maybe you found a better job in a different state, and so you're moving for that reason. Maybe you want to rejoin family that moved to a different part of the country, and so you're migrating to go and join them, right? There's lots of things that make people want to migrate. Climate is one of them, but because we have information about where you were before, where you moved to, and at what time, we know exactly what the situation was when you made that decision, and we have a whole bunch of data on the political, social, and economic conditions of the place that you decided to leave, of the place that you decided to move to at exactly the time when you made that decision. So we have this really large data set, and one of the contributions that we do here is we say, we know from previous literature that the costs of migration are really important in determining whether or not you move. But these costs of migration are very complicated to capture, right? Part of it is just the cost of the gas to get somewhere. Another part of it is the fact that, you're going to have to, there's all sorts of psychological costs of moving from one place to another. There's the cost of social integration of moving from one place to another. So you have all sorts of costs, really hard to capture. And previous literature have really just kind of looked and said, well, if you're moving really far, it's going to be very expensive. If you're moving close, it's going to be cheaper. So we have this very rough measure of cost. In this paper, we provide a much better measure of cost, which takes into account not just how far you are, but also how over the span of 3 decades, it might have gotten much easier for you to get to this place that's far away, or maybe something made it harder for you to move somewhere else, right? So we have this measure of cost, and you can see those maps here. It gives you an idea of what kind of weather changes we're looking at in Brazil over this 30-year time span. So over 30 years, there's been about a 1-degree increase in temperatures in Brazil. You can see from the little map on the left, the darker colors, that's about 2.5-degree increase over the span of 30 years. Other places with the lighter colors, you've basically seen no change. There's a lot of variation, even within the country, about how much you can be affected by climate change. And on the right-hand side, you have the same thing with temperatures, with precipitation, with some places getting a lot wetter and some places suffering from droughts. So we have all this variation that we're going to exploit to boil down what is the role of climate in determining migration once we've accounted for the political, the economics, the social, and the cost of migration. And so I'm just going to go through a few of the results. I mean, we have a very wide data set, and so there's a lot that we can do with it. So I'm just going to pull out like the main things. The first thing, over like the 40 different regressions that we run in the paper, is that consistently, no matter how you specify the model, higher temperatures do push people out. That is a very clear message that we have from this. Keep in mind that we have temperatures and precipitation where you were, temperatures and precipitation where you moved to. The only thing that is consistently strong is the fact that higher temperatures in your origin push you out. We see migrants leaving the States. It is also very clear that the costs of migration matter a lot, and if the costs were less high, we would see a lot more migrants. And in particular, one thing is when we study the poorest states in Brazil, which tend to be, well, they are the states that have the highest agricultural population. In these states, if you have higher temperatures, less people move. And this is suggestive evidence of what we call a poverty trap. The idea is you might want to move, like you can't grow your crop anymore, you can't make an income. So you want to move, but you can't afford the cost of migrations because you don't have any savings, you don't have any assets that you can sell. And so you're trapped in this place where you can't make money. And this poverty trap is something that was documented in the broader migration literature, but for climate change, we have reason to believe that it would be more important. And the reason for this is because climate change is irreversible. It is much more permanent than other things that might make you move. Like political situation might get better, economic situation might get better, the climate is not going to get better. Moreover, you have to think about what those agricultural households, like what mechanisms they have to kind of insure themselves against those shocks. So if you're talking about climate change, like the kind of network of friends and family that you might call up and say, I'm not having a really good year, can you help me out so that I can weather this storm and I'll get you back next year? This network of friends and family are going to tend to be geographically close to you. And so chances are they're also affected by climate change. So they can't help you weather the storm because they're weathering the storm themselves. And so this makes this poverty trap story in the case of climate change potentially a lot more important. The one positive is that sugar farmers actually benefit from climate change in Brazil. These changes in temperatures that we're seeing in Brazil are making a lot more land appropriate for growing sugar. And we are seeing in our data set very clearly that the sugar farmers are being attracted by those destinations with rising temperatures where they can go and grow sugar. One thing that we were interested in looking at was trying to figure out from this wealth of data, can we see that the migrants understand that's what pushing them out is temperature? And one of the things that we thought was, well, if you understand that it's the temperatures that are leading you to leave, right? Again, there's lots of things going on in your world. Temperatures is just one of them, right? We're talking slow changes to the climate, so you may not really appreciate that it's happening. But if you understand that it's temperatures pushing you out, then we should see the farmers selecting their destination based on temperatures as well. And we do not see that. The one time where we do see the migrants selecting a destination based on weather is if you were exposed to a drought. That's much more salient, right? Like if you have a drought, it's very clear what's happening. There's no more water, you know your crops are dying because of it. And so when it comes to the northeast of the country, which is very drought prone, the agricultural migrants from that part of the country, when they move, they're very specifically selecting places with higher levels of precipitation. Right? But for the most part, outside of that one flow from the northeast of Brazil, we don't really see people selecting their destination based on weather. But one aspect, and then I will end there, that indicates that maybe the migrants, they might not understand that it's climate pushing them out, but one thing that seems to indicate that they understand that whatever's happening is irreversible is that they move with their family. We don't just see the head of the household moving and then with the intention of coming back. They move with the older generation, with the younger generation. You move your entire family, which would indicate that there's some understanding that whatever is happening, it's not going to get any better. And so the move is permanent. And that's all I have for you. Hopefully I didn't take too much time.
So many questions I'm sure arising from this important set of data and analysis. So hold on to them. I think we'll just go straight to Jesse and then we'll take questions.
Okay, Claire, that was fantastic. And there is so much to integrate in terms of overlapping understanding of causality and the way in which correlation is not causality. And you can see the role of climate in some way, but attribution of cause in a broader sense is more complex, and you bring that in as well. That's really very nice. A little mushroom I found today. Sorry, on the way over here.
Special mushroom?
Well, it's not. It may be psychedelic. It's a oyster mushroom, and they're just in Rock Creek Park walking here this morning or this afternoon. Okay.
Should I send it around?
Anybody who wants it, it may not make it back to New York tonight. So where are we in terms of my?
If you click
game.
no, I have all of the PowerPoints.
On the bottom.
Yes. Oh, I see.
Just keep going. Yeah.
Oh, very good. Okay, so basically, this talk, I framed it for about 10 minutes. And what I want to get at is that causality is a really difficult thing to attribute in migration. And in a way, I've been working on this for a long time in a lot of different settings. I'm trying to think through how we move from shallower framings like Amartya Sen's very powerful entitlements failures to what I'm calling an access failure, where you don't just take the conditions that people live in that make them precarious as given, but you ask, how did they get caused? And you bring in the distribution of resources and what have you as part of the causal structure of why and when people decide to pick up and leave. So the case that I'm dealing with is the Sahel. I did a lot of field work there with.
I think you need to click.
Oh, click. Oh, God. Yeah. Technology. I did this work with Papa Phi, a colleague of mine, and we spent about 1.5 years working on this. I was probably in the field for about 3 months, and he was in the field for about 6 months. And the basic, whoop, I clicked. Okay, I clicked again. So the simple points that I want to make, I think I probably already made them, is migration is launched by a lot of factors, right? Good and bad. Crises such as hunger, famine, dislocation, and economic loss that we associate with climate change often are also caused by many factors. And different models, and this is the important part, different models of causality have very different implications for practice, policy, response, and responsibility. The ability to respond is one thing, and responsibility is linked. So when we know causes, we know places we can intervene. And that gives us some ability, not always, to respond. And it also gives us the responsibility to act on what we know. So different models point to different causes, and different causes imply different potential solutions. Now, how on earth do we get rid of that bar?
You can look there.
Oh,
Otherwise-
yeah, it doesn't matter. It's just that it's up there. But anyway, it's okay. So I'm just going to keep going, and whatever happens, happens. So the case of Tambacounda in eastern Senegal. Okay, good. Charcoal. Okay, that's where we want to be. Yeah. So basically, this case study started when a boat sank off of Lampedusa with 726 migrants on board. There were 26 survivors. It was the worst disaster in the Mediterranean since World War II. And that disaster, I thought, oh, it's being called climate migrants by the New York Times, by Forbes magazine. I'm going to go study where they came from and how this happened. And Papa and I talked, and we worked out a research plan, and it turned out by happenstance. Many of these migrants came from the villages in eastern Senegal, where I worked for 35 years. So I went, and we basically talked to people early in the morning. People wake up in the village, and they find that somebody is gone. One of the young people is gone. They leave in the night, and they go to migrate across the desert. They migrate through Mali, through Niger, up through Libya, and there's a lot that happens in this. And let me just say that more than 50% of the households have somebody who is migrated. And 2% of the households have someone who has died, confirmed died in the migration in the last 5 years. And 8% have someone who left and they never heard from them again. This is big. And the region of Tambacounda is said to be a very low migration area in Senegal. Anyway, they go, and there you go, off of Lampedusa, packed into boats, they perish. And this is a terrible thing. It also, how do you study this? How do you study why these people left? A lot of them end up getting repatriated back, sent back to Senegal. And those are the people we talk to. Young people who, this guy graduated high school. Here he is digging a well. The wells are usually about 50 meters deep and hand dug, and that's what he's doing at home. So what is going on? Are they climate refugees? I think the answer is no. And the answer is no for a lot of reasons that may seem silly, but all the narratives of climate change in the Sahel are a bit strange because, in fact, rainfall was increasing. Crops were pretty much constant, and the hungry season was pretty much unchanged over a 20-year period up to this date. And so, was it getting worse? It was the greening of the Sahel. Well, it turns out there's a backstory to this that's even weirder, which is the greening of the Sahel and the lack of climate damage, as it were, is due to the fact that the droughts in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s that were terrible, famine in the region, were actually now only recently learned caused by aerosol forcing in Europe that caused that downturn. And now the recovery from that downturn is hiding some of the climate change effects in the area. So what is going on? Lots migrate, I already told you that. Are these really climate refugees? I don't think so. The climate is not necessarily a major factor. We do find that after good seasons, we get more migration in the area because people save up enough to go across the desert. So why on earth are they going? And how do we frame the causes of that risk of leaving? And I say risk, it's also a benefit. It's risky. I think the risk here is the dangerous journey, mainly. They get in trouble when they get to Europe as well, but that's a different set of risks. The typical model is a hazards model, right? You have a nice climate event and you have fixed structures. They're held constant. And those are, assets, protections, capacities, and all that. Climate is the cause of it. Those are held constant. And if there's a little change in climate, you correlate that with the change in hunger, famine, dislocation, economic loss, et cetera, and you see the role of climate. Well, it's a problematic model. There's a different model, Amartya Sen's model. And in Amartya Sen's model, you have what we call entitlement failure, which is when people don't have enough food to traverse their oral cavity, basically. And there are reasons for that, but those reasons have locations, right? In assets, lack of social protections, capabilities, which in his model are individualized capabilities and unexplained initial conditions. Stop at the initial conditions, but where did they come from? So you need a better model, at least I think better. By the way, climate is still in there. It's more on the margins, and a lot of the climate model where people don't like these models because it doesn't leave climate at the center of the universe. I have worked with the IPCC on this, and they liked my model back in the 90s. And then when they figured out that it put them at the edge of the problem, they didn't like it and rejected it. This is more of an access model where, just to say, it explains initial conditions, explains capabilities. You have to look at it. Stratified access to education and jobs. You have to look at it. Relations, identities, exploitation, expropriation, political exclusions, social differentiation, what I call access relations of access to government, access to resources, access to markets, have something to do with this. And so it's a little more complex, and climate is still in there, getting buried in there. And essentially, coming back to the Senegal story, what you have is pervasive subsistence crisis in an area. This is not new. I looked at charcoal and cotton in depth. I'm not going to be able to go into those cases today. You find no services, worse than during the colonial period in terms of agricultural service, in terms of health services. There are free health services in the area, but you go to get them and you're going to pay market price. Okay, the doctors will charge you. So will the agricultural government agents that are free. Young people can't come of age in this area for a whole variety of reasons that are very complex, and they cannot grow up to have roles in community and family, but also with the migration that's been going on for a long time and remittances coming back from Europe, this families receiving remittances, young women will marry into those families, but the families that don't receive remittances, young women are told not to marry, and so those young men can't marry. And then they're married off the ones with remittances in the family, or the young women, I should say girls, they're really 13, 14, 15 years old. They get married off, and they basically are married to migrants who are not there. So what do? Boys and girls are getting together, they get pregnant, the ones who aren't married, and families break down, social services break down. The families with remittance do not give people resources when they are in need because their family member in Europe says, don't give the remittances away, right? So it's breaking down the reciprocities that used to hold things together. It's kind of a funny thing. It goes back. You have to understand why this happened. It goes back to circumstances of access to resources and the like. This is just a little painting that I had someone do for a ditty that I wrote once, which is the guy in the colonial period holds the rule book. How did these rules come into being? And he says, look, Here in the rule book, which you must obey, you have rights to the things that we don't take away, but we can't take the wood without taking the trees. So you'll have to make do with the stumps and some seeds. You can grow village woodlots. Eucalyptus or pine will help you to manage them through incentives and fines. If you listen, look, learn, and do as we say, even democratization will be on its way. We must protect forests from people like you so that people with business will have business to do. So this isn't free markets. This is basically structured situations where people don't have opportunities. And to wrap this up, how do we then model in that world that was put together under laws that excluded people from markets, people of certain identities and origins, charged them for land and the like in ways that they had not had to do before? How do we model it? It looks like a spaghetti diagram. It gets complicated very quickly. And you start looking at the relations. And you can look at this, but it doesn't take a short time. I've been embedded in this community since 1986. It's a while. And what you begin seeing is, just to break it down a little, climate is still there. It plays a role, but what role does it play? Climate events and trends are causing discourses. Young men are being told, and I say young men because they're the ones migrating in this case, told things are going to get worse. This increases anxiety. By the way, vulnerabilities are already an anxiety even before the damage occurs. So there's damage to begin with. International donors respond to this and invest in particular ways, usually in climate proofing. But climate does affect forestry, peanuts, millet, maize, and cotton in this area in certain ways, but it turns out it wasn't a climate issue here in the sense of climate change because the climate was relatively constant. But the discourses that you see feed into the anxieties and dignities of young people in this area, and they don't see a future in place. So when they migrate, they say Barça wala Barsak, Barcelona or death. And there's a lot of death crossing the Sahara, but they don't mean death crossing the Sahara. When I interrogated them, they basically said, oh no, Barça wala Barsak. This is about death, the social death of staying here. Okay, so that is really, in a sense, the end. And I would say a causal model that places cause within the climate is very dangerous because it hides many of the other causes that may be cheaper and easier to respond to in the short term. The climate change will swamp and does have the kinds of effects that Claire's observing in real time in real places. But it has it for people who are, in many ways, economically marginalized to the degree that they cannot respond in ways that are more productive for themselves. And that is why they choose the dangerous migrations in that case. So voila, postscript, that's it. There's really no proscript. Different models point to different causes imply different potential solutions, and different causes locate responsibility in different institutions and individuals. Et voila. Anybody want a mushroom?
Hold your questions, hold the mushroom and raw.
Well, I'm not sure I can compete with Jesse's magisterial Zeusian recitation. I will try.
Zeus did inspire.
I thought maybe
The name of it is an ode to the Lorax.
I thought maybe the Lorax was figuring in. Sure. Okay, so I'm gonna this makes a nice complementarity because instead of talking about different causes of migration, I'm really going to be talking about different consequences of migration, and just going to be reporting briefly on ongoing work in which we've been engaged at the Center for Latin American Latino Studies around environmentally induced displacement. and focusing primarily, I would describe this as a kind of a research project focused on kind of policy worlds. And so what I'll be talking to you about really is kind of the state of policy around the ways in which we are currently thinking about the costs of displacement and migration. So I have some, I'm going to read it, but I'm going to try to read it in a lively and compelling way. So over the past decade, notable strides have been made to reduce, greenhouse gas emissions that are one of the major drivers of climate change. But much less energy has been given to preparing for the adaptations that societies will need to flourish in our climate-altered world, including accounting for the effects of substantial human displacement and resulting upheaval of mass migration and resettlement. I think it was already mentioned, but in what is projected to be the greatest mass movement in the history of humanity, as people flee more frequent and catastrophic climate disasters, retreat from shrinking coastlines, abandon overheated areas and crippled economies, and face food scarcity. Where will they go? What will happen when they arrive? How will communities adapt? Existing research and policy frameworks have barely begun to contemplate these questions, particularly in the ongoing tension between the global north and south over the responsibilities for climate change and extent of obligation to address it. Financing the costs imposed by the world's altering climate is unsurprisingly typically at the center of many of the debates and disagreement. In context of climate-induced displacement, such costs are usually attached to the economic and material losses incurred as a result of climate disasters, including destruction of productive assets, critical infrastructure, built structures such as houses and other property. Considerations of loss and damage in climate policy settings typically stop there. In contrast, a multi-year research program at American University's Center for Latin American Studies has given attention to responses of communities throughout the region to environmental change, most recently in context of environmentally induced displacement, instead focusing more on expressed anxieties that include non-material and non-economic forms of loss. This research has documented the prevalence of uncertainty, moral, religious unease, potential disruptions of social relations, cultural alienation, loss of collective identity, memory, belonging, and displacement from what we might call local worlds of significance. Our work has highlighted the need for a more ambitious research agenda to address what in policy circles we would call non-economic loss. That might complement existing attention in policy circles to the material and economic costs of climate change. The recent COP27 meetings, which I think Garrett was at, Sharm el-Sheikh, will be remembered primarily, I think, for the agreement announced with much fanfare to establish a so-called loss and damage fund to support countries most vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. The details of this financial mechanism, who should pay, how it will operate, have yet to be worked out and will no doubt be fraught. But this amounts to a commitment in principle on the part of wealthy nations to participate in a fund to provide financial support to countries facing an array of climate impacts. While a new loss and damage fund is an important advancement, it is probably also going to divert attention from necessary research to provide a more robust understanding of the diverse forms and impacts of loss and damage in the context of climate-induced displacement. Research that I think ideally we should have preceded and informed the development of such a fund. Non-economic loss is perhaps the least well understood form of loss, and one that so far has received the least systematic attention from the research community. In the context of climate displacement and environmental migration, few studies have examined forms of loss not primarily understandable in terms of measurable cost or addressable through different ways of or forms of financial compensation. If we hope to improve understanding of diverse kinds of loss, filling this void should be a priority. Non-economic loss emerged only recently as a consideration of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, and has so far received notably less attention from researchers than has economic laws. A ground-clearing technical report, now about a decade old, listed the following examples of non-economic loss, and they are as follows. Life, sort of an open-ended commitment there. Health, displacement and human mobility, seen itself as a form of loss. Territory, cultural heritage, local and indigenous knowledge, biodiversity, and ecosystem services. That last is my favorite. Researchers have continued to rely on this list to orient their work when identifying and investigating non-economic loss. But I think it raises more questions than it answers. While a case can be made for each of these, and we don't have time for a lot of it, but it's unclear what might distinguish many of the items on this list from others not included here, or whether they are meant more as examples of larger types of possible or sets of things that we might categorize under the umbrella non-economic loss. Also, it's not always the case, while it's not always the case, many of the items on this list are in fact often, do in fact often have economic relevance. So it's not clear why they're specifically listed as non-economic forms of loss. Finally, many of these overlap, co-implicate one another in complex ways, suggested by some of the flowcharts and models we were just looking at. So it's for this reason that analysts have largely drawn attention to an inability consistently and unambiguously to discriminate economic from non-economic loss resulting from climate change. While this list continues to set the multilateral policy agenda for what constitutes non-economic loss, it isn't really supported by a robust research base. Nevertheless, a tendency to convert non-economic losses into measurable monetary assets is well entrenched in the research community. Prevailing assumption is that diverse forms of non-economic loss are best explained by assigning them a quantitative value to make them comparable to measures of economic loss in different ways. A point of departure driven more by the exigencies of accounting than by the research. It reflects the frequency for which climate solutions take the form of financial commitments, as with the new loss and damage fund, and so the need to calculate costs. Right, so I'm understanding why this happens this way, but there's a cost to this kind of way of calculating costs. Scholarship directly addressing the value of non-economic loss is therefore typically dedicated to developing accounting procedures for converting non-economic cultural resources, for example, practices and expressions important for the collective identity of communities displaced by a climate-related disaster such as sea level rise or catastrophic weather events, into measurable numeric value. Little, if any, research has examined the extent to which such an approach does or does not meaningfully capture how communities themselves experience and understand such losses. In the rare instance of research on non-economic loss, the topic of intangible loss, these are all terms of note within a policy space, is an even more under-theorized afterthought. A modest body of research concerned with the impacts of climate upon cultural heritage as one recognized form of non-economic loss does allow us to observe some emerging trends, and I'll just point to a few of the important ones. Research has so far overwhelmingly focused upon the role of climate change in hastening or accelerating the physical, chemical, and biological degradation of vulnerable built structures, archaeological sites, historical buildings, monuments, artifacts, sacred landscapes, along with other culturally relevant places. Attention to so-called tangible heritage, in short, has so far driven the research agenda. Intangible heritage, when considered at all, is frequently treated as necessarily contingent upon the former, as the sites, places, and artifacts through which, say, beliefs, myths, rituals, stories, among other forms of intangible culture, are understood to be expressed and expressible. We might describe the state of affairs as promoting a kind of repository approach to the values and meaning of intangible heritage, where the intangible is both contained by and only expressible through necessarily present tangible vehicles of one sort or another. So it's unsurprising that attention is mainly focused on material or tangible climate-related loss. This reflects several factors. I'll just point to two very obvious ones that as I said, shouldn't surprise us. An important precedent for research on loss and damage in Latin America, for example, is prior work examining the challenges of displacement and resettlement from large-scale development, infrastructure development projects, which in a more general way has kind of been used as a kind of blueprint for how to respond to large-scale climate impacts, which is of course focused on material consequences such as the loss of housing, land, property, when people are forcibly displaced to somewhere else as a result of a hydroelectric dam or something. Another is that greater attention has been given to crises of disaster-induced displacement. This is a longer discussion I'm happy to have, but where disasters, the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, the hurricane seasons of 2017, 2018 in the Caribbean, often stand in for climate change more generally, which is why I was interested in Claire's emphasis on a slow onset climate disasters, because when we look at how the multilateral system is shaping up to, orient its response to climate impacts, disasters and sort of the eventfulness that comes with those disasters is kind of a critical way in which those resources are mobilized, liberated, channeled into different things. And typically in the post-disaster humanitarian moment, we're talking about urgent questions of health, livelihood, property, and other damaged or destroyed assets. Nevertheless, if we hope to better understand the implications of intangible heritage loss in the context of environmental migration, it will be necessary to move beyond limiting formulations of culture as place-specific, embedded in landscapes, or inescapably contingent upon physical heritage sites of one sort or another, and where to be displaced is too often simplistically equated with intangible heritage loss. Such repository approaches often take for granted that the meaningful horizon of intangible heritage is commensurate with, contained in, places, sites, landscapes. They also tend to assume that cultural understandings, for example, of my identity or of collective identity, necessarily and primarily emerge from the material assemblages and topographies that compose those sites. Put another way, rather than treating the intangible as an autonomous domain for the generation of value and meaning, research on cultural heritage loss regularly converts the intangible into the tangible, which again equates it with a material asset. Doing so, of course, better enables non-economic values to be included in economic decision-making. But it is also unlikely to capture the significance of diverse forms of intangible loss expressed by or experienced by migrants. Research agendas would benefit by broadening their attention to counting losses through the development of a new anthropology, say, of how migrants interpret loss, or what we might call a kind of a hermeneutics of loss. The problem of loss and damage has currently moved to the forefront of global policy discussions about how best to frame the relationship between climate change and migration as an emerging third pillar, let's say, alongside mitigation and adaptation. In the lead up to the next COP28 meeting this year in 2023 and beyond, the details of a new financial mechanism to address climate-induced loss will be widely debated. However, so far, these discussions show little sign of taking account of the range of variation of types of loss and their diverse impacts. All forms of environmental displacement and loss are not equally well handled through multilateral or state-based financial compensation. Development of a research agenda concerned with identifying types of non-economic loss, understanding their impacts in context of displacement, anticipating how best to address these in both policy and practice is long overdue. And I'll stop there with that, but then briefly, I just want to give you some instantiations of what we're talking about here and what I have in mind. So just 4 quick examples. These are all just taken from Mexico, and they're all instances of items from Mexico on the UNESCO's intangible cultural heritage list, right? So these are protected heritage sites. The first here is a scene of the romeria or pilgrimage in the ritual cycle of the carrying of the Virgin of Zapopan, which where's Zapopan? I think it's in, does anyone remember? I forget. I think it's in Jalisco, in the state of Jalisco, yeah. And the key thing about this is that the description for the listing of the site as protected focuses almost entirely on the structure of the church as the key thing that has to be maintained. These alarming looking mushroom-like fungi-like walking fungi are actually called parachicos, and they participate in the traditional January feast of Chiapa de Corzo, which is in the city of Chiapas, Mexico. And here the key thing is the vestments, the clothing is the thing that is the focus of the heritage, why it's on the heritage list, the intangible heritage list. Next. This is an interesting thing. So throughout the French have made this popular, but throughout the country, the world, it's very common to get traditional cuisine on an intangible heritage list. And so traditional Mexican cuisine is actually on the list. But the way this happens is it's broken down into critical different elements, each of which have regional or sort of state-specific relevance. So this is the paradigm that was given for the state of Michoacan, which is in South Mexico, right, which has different ingredients and other kinds of things, as an ancestral source of cuisine. Yeah, let's do one more. This is more along the lines of places of memory and which support living traditions. The Otomi Chichimecas people of Toliman, which is the Peña de Bernal, it's a sacred territory, and this processional here is an annual event that outlines the sanctity of the territory and defines it as a sacred space. But again, it's the territory that is the sacred entity, right? And so there's a lot more to say here, but one of the kind of interesting things about this is we're seeing simultaneously the sort of transformation of beliefs and practices into material entities that can then be supported through heritage practice. And we're also in a kind of interesting way that I didn't touch on really here, but seeing the sort of folklorization of cultural expression as it becomes administrated. Anyway, I'll stop here and talk about it.
Now we're into it, all these different disciplines addressing this topic. It's so valuable, and that's the theme for all of CC. Let's take 3 questions, give them to our crew, and then see if we have time for another batch after that. Yes. Yeah.
Artie Crutcher. There was a recent article in The Guardian about the risk of indigenous language loss with thriving speeds. This is probably the last we've heard, not all. So I wonder, this may be more into your research, Rob, but I wonder if you saw anything, Claire, even the Brazil data that you had, if that shows up in the case studies that you're looking at. And to you, Rob, then would language as an intangible cultural heritage somehow be more, I don't know, palatable or recognizable thing as far as drawing attention to intangible heritage that's not monetarily quantified?
That's such an excellent question. Yes.
So what a question around climate as a factor in migration. So if you're saying that it is not the main factor, but is there any evidence that it could be considered like a tipping point with respect to all the other factors and all that, but then climate comes in and becomes this tipping point? So it's not a main factor, but it will be possible that it's a tipping point that then causes all to make a decision. And then the second question is about this sort of work that we said collected about 10 million household data. Did I get you right?
It's census data. I didn't collect it, but
Oh,
yes.
census data, not
Yes.
your data for your climate research.
Right.
Okay. My question then is this. Is there a line between academic work that you're doing and surveillance of people? When we collect all this data about climate and their movement from point A to point B, and we got all this data out there, where is the line between just, this is academic work and this is a form of surveillance that could be used by, who knows, the state, and other security operators, and other bad faith actors that we know exist in other countries. If you go to Nigeria, people are around. And all these bad faith actors are ready to tell you what this means.
Those were such good questions. Let's just take notes. We'll just start with this.
David, you good?
Sure. So Marley, that article, you're talking about language, is that the main
Yeah,
point?
it's just funny. The article is focusing on island nations. So writing seeds, you would cover up the entire island. You've got, I don't know, 10 different indigenous languages there. Then when the people move, they've got less perhaps connection to then teach the younger and the language dies off.
Right,
So
right.
I don't know enough about Brazil, those locations, but I imagine that there's also a number of, very small languages in that area, and if it comes up at all in that. And
Yeah.
you saw.
So, we're looking at migration within Brazil, right? So, as opposed to international migration where language plays more of a role, right? But even within Brazil, you're going to have, communities that might have their own language. A lot of that is going to happen like in the Amazonian region. We're not actually seeing a lot of migration either to or from the Amazonian region. So this is not something that is going to be like big in determining, like, it's small flows compared to all the other flows we see within the country. So it's probably not going to affect like our quantitative results very much, right? But it is something that, we are taking into account like differences in language, right? That's part of the estimation. But I can't answer it more precisely than that, I guess. That's all, sorry, I was taking notes on the question. There it is. On the data and the surveillance, so as I say, we use census data, so we're not responsible for like either collecting the data or protecting the privacy of the data or what it's used for. These census data, they are being made publicly accessible. It's a very small thing that you have to do to get access to it. And so, yeah, technically, I mean, there's no identifying information. I can't say like this is Mr. X, but I can say there's a lot of migrants coming from that place. And so I guess a bad faith actor could use census data to identify like where people are coming from. But when the US Census was done a couple of years ago, there were like questions about whether or not we should have a citizenship question on the census, right? And one of the big challenges to that was, if you do that, then you're going to be able to identify like who's an illegal migrant, for example. And so, the census are typically, they're not used for that. They're not usually questions that allow you to identify that. But there was an effort to try to put one of those questions recently. It just was not done in the end. And about the tipping points, what was the question about the tipping point?
Basically, all the factors that come into play, right? That make people move. And you can see that climate change is one amongst many factors. But from climate change of being the tipping point, even if it was not central, but something that just made it clearer to the person that, what, this has happened, that has happened, that has happened, this has happened, finally, I'm going.
Yeah. So I completely agree. And when we look at, and I'm going to let other people talk about other dimensions of this, but at least in our estimation, when we're looking at the effect of climate, we're not thinking of climate as this linear effect, right? We're not saying that 1 degree going from 10 to 11 is the same as 1 degree going from 39 to 40 degrees, right? So we're allowing for those kinds of thresholds where after a certain effect, you see like climate acting more as like pushing more people out. We're allowing for these things. We're like thinking about like extreme events. We're thinking about anomalies. We're thinking about standard deviations. We're thinking about all sorts of things that will allow us to have nonlinear effects of climate. So we do account for this. And I think there are going to be times where like the climate interacts with other factors where you could have a tipping point in that interaction. That's not something that we capture so far, but it's something that we could think about. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for the questions. I think really the only one I can respond to is Emmanuel's. And I should introduce Emmanuel Nuaseri, who just asked the question, new here on the campus, a new asset for us all. Can't reduce to monetary values, but
Sometimes it's necessary.
Emmanuel was teaching in Mauritius and before that in Illinois, and brings a lot of field work and experience with him. The tipping point question, I like to think of it more as a trigger than a tipping point. And the question is, who loaded the gun of precarity so that when you pull the trigger, something happens? In other words, who stuck people on the cliff of precarity so that a little bit of wind or a little higher temperature will push them off? So 1 degree for somebody who's poor and excluded is a very different question than 1 degree for someone who's rich and powerful. And it may work in different ways, right? The rich and powerful may move sooner because, you know, they can capitalize on something somewhere else. The poor may move sooner because they simply can't survive, or it's so nonlinear, as Claire said, that I don't like the tipping point analogy. And I also, in a paper that I wrote with a group of climate modelers very recently at Columbia University, one of the things we determined is you cannot put a quantitative figure on the degree to which a migration was caused by a climate change. So if you had a climate change that was 3% increase in the intensity of a storm or something, that doesn't mean 3% more migration. For the poor, it may mean 300 times more migration, and for the rich, it may mean 0% more migration. So again, you got to go back to the spaghetti diagram, and it's going to be place contingent and culturally contingent and the like.
I'm vaguely hungry. I don't know why. I like that phrase, who loaded the gun of precarity. That's really effective, I think, as a sentence. So on linguistic question, language loss, yes, that's obviously often the first kind of intangible loss people want to talk about. Interestingly, there's a history of it to the way that it's come into policy agendas. Small island developing states, you were talking about, I think Pacific Island states, were disproportionately influential in driving at an early point, say 1991, when Tuvalu was the first to bring the idea of loss and damage into multilateral discussions about what to do, have kind of really shaped how we think about that stuff. And I would just note that that has kind of consequences for how we imagine the kind of alignments of all of these broader questions, because small island developing states can more easily make a case for the kind of commensurate overlap of a people in a place with a coherent culture, identity, and language. You know, a kind of stock, you know, kind of mid-20th century version of, say, the anthropological concept of culture, which we might not think about in quite those ways today. But actually, small island developing states politically and in fact often resemble such things. And so in that context, language loss tends to be handled, tends to be high on the agenda, precisely because what we're seeing is the problem of moving from island or archipelagos to mainlands and the dispersion of communities. But I would just hasten to add that many other folks who are going to have to move and who speak languages other than, you know, sort of dominant or hegemonic languages are you know, urban, in the millions of peoples, and, you know, maybe don't necessarily neatly coincide with our vision of language loss as related to, you know, the collapse of some particular locatable society. There's more to say there. This great question about the possibility of surveillance as a result of data collection. Absolutely. And I mean, I think that one of the things that's changed in the last decade or two of, say, ethnographically driven research of the kind that, you know, someone like a sociocultural anthropologist like myself might do is, you know, the deep attentiveness to the implications of and vulnerabilities that are exploitable of communities that are already marginalized in complicated ways by the presence of someone who's interested in extracting data from those communities, right? And I think we've kind of learned from that process. But I would also add, in the context of migrants who are tremendously vulnerable, particularly when in transit, the flip side of surveillance is visibility. And one of the things that we see in some of the more politically contentious contexts of migration is that migrants sometimes welcome visibility. In other words, fellow travelers, advocates, activists who bring attention to their vulnerability, particularly when in transit, as a political tool. I'm thinking of the caravanas in, arriving from Central America, coming to the southern border of the US. These were very performative and important ways, interested in wide media exposure to kind of give them the kinds of political clout that they lacked. One brief comment on the tipping point question. Those same people, I'm thinking of folks coming from the Northern Triangle of Central America, that is often associated with an unproblematic account of climate migrant, which is to say, if we look in this hemisphere, where are the climate migrants? Okay, well, the Northern Triangle of Central America, a clear instance of the increase of climate migration. But those folks might be fleeing, economic collapse, criminality and violence, and failed states.
Absolutely.
But when you ask them why are they migrating, they don't tell you climate change. That's just not a thing that people are likely to say. So they might say something about it's impossible. I used to be a coffee farmer, now I can't do that.
Right.
Okay, but they're never going to identify climate change. And so one of the enduring research problems of researching climate change as one among multiple factors that drive the movements of people is what people will tell you, which is very rarely that climate change has anything to do with it.
Great question. Through lines of agrarian crisis and policing. We'll take 2 or 3 more. Yeah, these two, Kashfi and Adam.
Thanks so much, first of all. So I'm wondering from a multilateral institutions perspective. So I'm wondering from the multilateral development institutions perspective, and perhaps Professor Ribbon, I would like to hear your perspective on it, but I fear that the same neocolonial policies of giving aid would be followed now in terms of when there's climate catastrophe or this climate crisis. I think the floods in Pakistan. So I'm wondering if there's a way we can avoid that, if there's a better model that institutions can adopt. So just wondering from that perspective.
Kashfi, who's also a CC part of the team. And then Adam, final question. Esteemed alum.
Thank you for your talks. I want to pick up on something all 3 of you have gestured to and just invite you to say more. I'm finding the word climate to be increasingly problematic in our discussion here. I wonder, in the Anthropocene, lots of people wonder, are we in the Anthropocene? Are we in the racial capitalist scene? Are we in the plantationist scene? To what extent is this talk about climate actually then reifying an international political economy and a discursive set of actors and reports and the UN and international donors and people who pay money to put their names on the front doors of schools so that we can have programs to study climate change, when it seems like all 3 of you have gestured to climate is one of many dispossessing exploitative forces loading the gun of precarity. And does it actually then get in the way if we're talking about protecting people whose land might be bulldozed, whose sacred territory might be bulldozed? That's not climate change that's doing it. It's somebody behind the wheel of a bulldozer, or it's ethno-nationalism and exploitation that leaves people in place, that rich people can migrate and get out of the way, and yet the poor often remain behind to be subjected to whatever comes next. I wonder if we're talking so much about one thing because it's vogue and missing our analysis. The spaghetti diagram seems a lot closer to reality and actuality than one overarching paradigm that funds a giant complex of, sorry, I'm a little bitter about cops and everything else, but it feels like we're beating around the bush and trying to talk about an academic topic as opposed to.
Yeah. That's a great question. So just quickly on the development, multilateral development perspective, just one, I think Jess probably can be more eloquent than I can, but one of the things that I would point out, and this is overlapping a bit with the implications of your question, is that who are the main actors in the multilateral climate drama? And those are largely nation states. And so because they're nation states and because the participation in the multilateral cooperative, whatnot, is always going to be the nation state first. I think that the key dynamic around avoiding, neocolonial and other kinds of well-worn grooves is to really examine the relationship between the multilateral nation states and then intra-state diversity and, how states deal with the resources that they're going to be given to manage different problems, right? And, I think that particularly with, sub-state regional community issues, that's going to be really challenging for many states to do. We're going to see inequities, asymmetries, unequal distribution of resources. We're going to see those things. Just really quickly on what you said. So one thing is that I think it's always helpful to remember that like climate is just a vague term we use to cover all kinds of crazy stuff happening ecologically and socially and economically. So sometimes we get caught in the shorthand of the need to communicate efficiently, and we shouldn't mistake that to mean that we're reducing it to, a set of, familiar problems and solutions. Although that's got to happen. Everything that you described, got to happen. Absolutely. No question about it. So it's sort of like over and above, and despite the fact that all of those things are going to happen, what is our collective room for maneuver? And I would also just point to the fact that we have been a little more successful recently in kind of leveraging, terms like climate justice to balance exclusive attention to kind of resource allocation in ways that I think will pay some dividends, particularly as that maintains a bottom-up momentum rather than a kind of a top-down and vertical structure, right? But yeah, you're right to be skeptical. It's a huge undertaking, the likes of which we've never seen, and there's going to be plenty of people that are going to want to take advantage of it.
Claire, you want to jump in?
I would just say in response to your question, I would just say that I think, what we've all talked about shows that we're not just thinking about climate independent from everything else, right? Like we are trying in our research, and those of us who are like particularly focused on causality, like we can't just dismiss everything else, right? Like we're like very aware of the fact that all of these things are intertwined, and it makes it really, really difficult to identify like what is actually going on, what are the consequences, and how do you allocate money and all that stuff. But it's what we have to do, and so we're doing it like one little step at a time.
Yeah. I'm reminded of the title of an article I wrote, Vulnerability Does Not Fall from the Sky. It's on the ground. But I'm reminded also of, I worked for the Beckman Institute of Technology and high tech and tech and let's fix everything through innovating and the hell with asking why things happen institute at University of Illinois. And I was on allocating money for research on climate change. And every single thing they wanted to do was innovation. And every single problem they identified, I said, but we have the solution. It's on the table. It's on the shelves. Why aren't we using it? This has nothing to do with climate. This has to do with greed. We have cars that get high efficiency. We have cars that go much further on less fuel. This is not about the climate. This doesn't fall from the sky. So you're right. I think it is about extraordinary greed in a system. I never used to say capitalism. No, because I thought empirical. I'm working from the crisis to very local factors, but I am watching my mother in an old age home. I think it is the sickest system we ever lived in. And it's called capitalism, and it is screwing us. So there you go. I mean, that's part of it. But it's screwing us through many, 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 many channels. And we have to understand every one of them empirically and specifically, and not sit around just yelling broad names. On the aid, James Morambedzi and I worked together at COP27. He was inside negotiating for the Union, the African Union, and for the Economic Commission on Africa. And he wrote a very nice piece right after, basically saying the agreement on losses and damages, basically with the fund, came to the conclusion of the partner states that there will be perhaps a fund. It may not be funded, but all interventions will be done at the mutual benefit of the donor and the recipient. In other words, they're saying it's going to be a market. And I think that's the end of it. It's more, you know, to use a very subtle term for it, it's just bullshit on bullshit. And voila, I think that's enough.
Do we end there? But thanks, Paul. That's good.
Okay.